Hello, this is Morale Bernard with the continuation of the story Secret Adversary. Last words were that, now then, sit on the bed. Put your hands above your head. And if you value your life, don't move them. Okay. By the way, please subscribe to the channel and please share the video. Thank you. Let us continue with Secret Adversary. Tuppence obeyed passively. Her good sense told her that there was nothing else to do but accept the situation. If she cried for help, there was very little chance of anyone hearing her, whereas there was probably quite a good chance of Mrs. Vandermeyer's shooting her. In the meantime, every minute of delay gained was valuable. Mrs. Vandermeyer laid down the revolver on the edge of the washstand within reach of her hand, and still eyeing Tuppence like a lynx in case the girl should attempt to move, she took a little stoppered bottle from its place on the marble and poured some of its contents into a glass, which she filled up with water. "What's that?" asked Tuppence sharply. "Something to make you sleep soundly." Tuppence paled a little. "Are you going to poison me?" she asked in a whisper. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Vandermeyer, smiling agreeably. "Then I shan't drink it," said Tuppence firmly. "I'd much rather be shot. At any rate, that would make a row, and someone might hear it. But I won't be killed off quietly like a lamb." Mrs. Vandermeyer stamped her foot. "Don't be a little fool. Do you really think I want a hue and cry for murder out after me? If you've any sense at all, you realize that poisoning you wouldn't suit my book at all. It's a sleeping draught, that's all. You'll wake up tomorrow morning, none the worse. I simply don't want the bother of tying you up and gagging you. That's the alternative, and you won't like it. I can tell you. I can be very rough if I choose. So drink this down like a good girl, and you'll be none the worse for it." In her heart of hearts, Tuppence believed her. The arguments she had adduced rang true. It was a simple and effective method of getting her out of the way for the first time being. Nevertheless, the girl did not take kindly to the idea of being tamely put to sleep without as much as one bid for freedom. She felt that once Mrs. Vandermeyer gave them the slip, the last hope of finding Tommy would be gone. Tuppence was quick in her mental processes. All these reflections passed through her mind in a flash, and she saw where a chance, a very problematical chance, lay, and she determined to risk all in one supreme effort. Accordingly, she lurched suddenly off the bed and fell on her knees before Mrs. Vandermeyer, clutching her skirts frantically. "I don't believe it," she moaned. "It's poison. I know it's poison. Oh, don't make me drink it." Her voice rose to a shriek. "Don't make me drink it." Mrs. Vandermeyer, glass in hand, looked down with a curling lip at this sudden collapse. "Get up, you little idiot. Don't go on drivelling there. How you ever had the nerve to play your part as you did, I can't think." She stamped her foot. "Get up, I say." But Tuppence continued to cling and sob, interjecting her sobs with incoherent appeals for mercy. Every minute gained was to the good. Moreover, as she grovelled, she moved imperceptibly nearer to her objective. Mrs. Vandermeyer gave a sharp, impatient exclamation and jerked the girl to her knees. "Drink it at once." Imperiously she pressed the glass to the girl's lips. Tuppence gave one last despairing moan. "You swear it won't hurt me?" she temporized. Of course it won't hurt you. Don't be a fool. Will you swear it? Yes, yes, said the other impatiently. I swear it. Tuppence raised a trembling hand to the glass. Very well. Her mouth opened meekly. Mrs. Vandermeyer gave a sigh of relief, off her guard for the moment. Then, quick as a flash, Tuppence jerked the glass upward as hard as she could. The fluid in it splashed into Mrs. Vandermeyer's face, and during her momentary gasp, Tuppence's right hand shot out and grasped the revolver where it lay on the edge of the washstand. The next moment, she had sprung back a pace, and the revolver pointed straight at Mrs. Vandermeyer's heart, with no unsteadiness in the hand that held it. In the moment of victory, Tuppence betrayed a somewhat unsportsmanlike triumph. Now, who's on top and who's underneath? She crowed. The other's face was convulsed with rage. For a minute, Tuppence thought she was going to spring upon her, which would have placed the girl in an unpleasant dilemma, since she meant to draw the line at actually letting off the revolver. However, with an effort, Mrs. Vandermeyer controlled herself, and at last a slow, evil smile crept over her face. Not a fool, then, after all. You did that well, girl. But you shall pay for it, oh yes. You shall pay for it. I have a long memory. I'm surprised you should have been gulled so easily, said Tuppence scornfully. Did you really think I was the kind of girl to roll about on the floor and whine for mercy? You may do some day, said the other significantly. The cold malignity of her manner sent an unpleasant chill down Tuppence's spine, but she was not going to give in to it. Supposing we sit down, she said pleasantly. Our present attitude is a little melodramatic. No, not on the bed. Draw a chair up to the table. That's right. Now, I'll sit opposite you with the revolver in front of me, just in case of accidents. Splendid. Now let's talk. What about? Said Mrs. Vandermeyer sullenly. Tuppence eyed her thoughtfully for a minute. She was remembering several things. Boris's words, I believe you would sell us. And her answer, the price would have to be enormous. Given likely it was true, yet might not there be a substratum of truth in it? Long ago, had not Whittington asked, who's been blabbing? Rita? Would Rita Vandermeyer prove to be the weak spot in the armour of Mr. Brown? Keeping her eyes fixed steadily on the other's face, Tuppence replied quietly, Money. Mrs. Vandermeyer started. Clearly the reply was unexpected. What do you mean? I'll tell you. You said just now that you had a long memory. A long memory isn't half as useful as a long purse. I dare say it relieves your feelings a good deal to plan out all sorts of dreadful things to do to me. But is that practical? Revenge is very unsatisfactory. Everyone always says so. But money. Tuppence warmed to her pet creed. Well, there's nothing unsatisfactory about money, is there? Do you think, said Mrs. Vandermeyer scornfully, that I am the kind of woman to sell my friends? Yes, said Tuppence promptly, if the price was big enough. A paltry £100 or so. No, said Tuppence, I should suggest 100,000. Her economical spirit did not permit her to mention the whole $1,000,000 suggested by Julius. A flush crept over Mrs. Vandermeyer's face. "What did you say?" she asked, her fingers playing nervously with a brooch on her breast. In that moment, Tuppence knew that the fish was hooked, and for the first time she felt a horror of her own money-loving spirit. It gave her a dreadful sense of kinship to the woman fronting her. £100,000, repeated Tuppence. The light died out of Mrs. Vandermeyer's eyes. She leaned back in her chair. "Bah," she said. "You haven't got it?" "No," admitted Tuppence, "I haven't. But I know someone who has." "Who?" "A friend of mine." "Must be a millionaire," remarked Mrs. Vandermeyer unbelievingly. "As a matter of fact, he is. He's an American. He'll pay you that without a murmur. You can take it from me that it's a perfectly genuine proposition." Mrs. Vandermeyer sat up again. "I'm inclined to believe you," she said slowly. There was silence between them for some time. Then Mrs. Vandermeyer looked up. "What does he want to show? Or what does he want to know, this friend of yours?" Tuppence went through a momentary struggle, but it was Julius' money, and his interests must come first. "He wants to know where Jane Finn is," she said boldly. Mrs. Vandermeyer showed no surprise. "I'm not sure where she is at the present moment," she replied. "But you could find out." "Oh, yes," returned Mrs. Vandermeyer carelessly. "There would be no difficulty about that." Then Tuppence's voice shook a little. "There's a boy, a friend of mine. I'm afraid something's happened to him through your pal Boris." "What's his name?" "Tommy Beresford." "Never heard of him, but I'll ask Boris. He'll tell me anything he knows." "Thank you." Tuppence felt a terrific rise in her spirits. It impelled her to more audacious efforts. "There's one thing more." "Well?" Tuppence leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Who is Mr. Brown?" Her quick eye saw the sudden paling of the beautiful face. With an effort, Mrs. Vandermeyer pulled herself together and tried to resume her former manner, but the attempt was a mere parody. She shrugged her shoulders. "You can't have learned much about us if you don't know that nobody knows who Mr. Brown is." "You do," said Tuppence quietly. Again the colour deserted the other's face. "What makes you think that?" "I don't know," said the girl truthfully, "but I'm sure." Mrs. Vandermeyer stared in front of her for a long time. "Yes," she said hoarsely at last, "I know. I was beautiful, you see. Very beautiful." "You are still," said Tuppence with admiration. Mrs. Vandermeyer shook her head. There was a strange gleam in her electric blue eyes. "Not beautiful enough," she said in a soft, dangerous voice. "Not beautiful enough. And sometimes lately I've been afraid. It's dangerous to know too much." She leaned forward across the table. "Swear that my name shan't be brought into it, that no one shall ever know." "I swear it. And once he's caught, you'll be out of danger." A terrified look swept across Mrs. Vandermeyer's face. "Shall I? Shall I ever be?" She clutched Tuppence's arm. "You're sure about the money?" "Quite sure." "When shall I have it? There must be no delay." This friend of mine will be here presently. You may have to send cables or something like that, but there won't be any delay. He's a terrific hustler." A resolute look settled on Mrs. Vandermeyer's face. "I'll do it. It's a great sum of money. And besides," she gave a curious smile, "it is not wise to throw over a woman like me." For a moment or two she remained smiling and lightly tapping her fingers on the table. Suddenly she started and her face blanched. "What was that?" "I heard nothing." Mrs. Vandermeyer gazed round her fearfully. If there should be someone listening. Nonsense. Who could there be? "Even the walls might have ears," whispered the other. "I tell you I'm frightened. You don't know him." "Think of the £100,000, said Tuppence soothingly. Mrs. Vandermeyer passed her tongue over her dried lips. "You don't know him," she reiterated hoarsely. "He's a—" With a cry of terror she sprang to her feet. Her outstretched hand pointed over Tuppence's head. Then she swayed to the ground in a dead faint. Tuppence looked round to see what had startled her. In the doorway were Sir James Peel Egerton and Julius Herschmeyer. Sir James brushed past Julius and hurriedly bent over the fallen woman. "Heart," he said sharply. "Seeing her so suddenly must have given her a shock. Brandy, and quickly, or she'll slip through our fingers." Julius hurried to the washstand. "Not there," said Tuppence over his shoulder. "In the tantalus in the dining room. Second door down the passage." Between them, Sir James and Tuppence lifted Mrs. Vandermeyer and carried her to the bed. There they dashed water in her face, but with no result. The lawyer fingered her pulse. "Touch and go," he muttered. "I wish that young fellow would hurry up with the brandy." At that moment Julius re-entered the room carrying a glass half full of the spirit which he handed to Sir James. While Tuppence lifted her head, the lawyer tried to force a little of the spirit between her closed lips. Finally the woman opened her eyes feebly. Tuppence held the glass to her lips. "Drink this." Mrs. Vandermeyer compiled. The brandy brought the colour back to her white cheeks and revived her in a marvellous fashion. She tried to sit up, then fell back with a groan, her hand to her side. "It's my heart," she whispered. "I mustn't talk." She lay back with closed eyes. Sir James kept his finger on her wrist a minute longer, then withdrew it with a nod. "She'll do now." All three moved away and stood together talking in low voices. One and all were conscious of a certain feeling of anticlimax. Clearly any scheme for cross-questioning the lady was out of the question for the moment. For the time being they were baffled and could do nothing. Tuppence related how Mrs. Vandermeyer had declared herself willing to disclose the identity of Mr. Brown, and how she had consented to discover and reveal to them the whereabouts of Jane Finn. Julius was congratulatory. "That's all right, Miss Tuppence. Splendid. I guess that £100,000 will look just as good in the morning to the lady as it did overnight. There's nothing to worry over. She won't speak without the cash anyway, you bet." There was certainly a good deal of common sense in this, and Tuppence felt a little comforted. "What you say is true," said Sir James meditatively. "I must confess, however, that I cannot help wishing we had not interrupted at the minute we did. Still, it cannot be helped. It is only a matter of waiting until the morning." He looked across at the inert figure on the bed. Mrs. Vandermeyer lay perfectly passive with closed eyes. He shook his head. Well, said Tuppence with an attempt at cheerfulness, we must wait until the morning, that's all. But I don't think we ought to leave the flat. What about leaving that bright boy of yours on guard? Albert. And suppose she came round again and hooked it. Albert couldn't stop her. I guess she won't want to make tracks away from the dollars. She might. She seemed very frightened of Mr. Brown. What? Real plump scared of him? Yes. She looked round and said even walls had ears. Maybe she meant a dictaphone, said Julius with interest. Miss Tuppence is right, said James quietly. We must not leave the flat, if only for Mrs. Vandermeyer's sake. Julius stared at him. You think he'd get after her between now and tomorrow morning? How could he know, even? You forget your own suggestion of a dictaphone, said Sir James dryly. We have a very formidable adversary. I believe, if we exercise all due care, that there is a very good chance of his being delivered into our hands. But we must neglect no precaution. We have an important witness, but she must be safeguarded. I would suggest that Miss Tuppence should go to bed, and that you and I, Mr. Herschmeyer, should share the vigil. Tuppence was about to protest, but happening to glance at the bed, she saw Mrs. Vandermeyer, her eyes half open, with such an expression of mingled fear and malevolence on her face that it quite froze the words on her lips. For a moment she wondered whether the faint and the heart attack had been a gigantic sham, but remembering the deadly pallor, she could hardly credit the supposition. As she looked, the expression disappeared as by magic, and Mrs. Vandermeyer lay inert and motionless as before. For a moment the girl fancied she must have dreamt it, but she determined nevertheless to be on the alert. Well, said Julius, I guess we'd better make a move out of here anyway. The others fell in with his suggestion. Sir James again felt Mrs. Vandermeyer's pulse. Perfectly satisfactory, he said in a low voice to Tuppence. She'll be absolutely all right after a night's rest. The girl hesitated a moment by the bed. The intensity of the expression she had surprised and impressed her powerfully. Mrs. Vandermeyer lifted her lids. She seemed to be struggling to speak. Tuppence bent over her. Don't leave. She seemed unable to proceed, murmuring something that sounded like sleepy. Then she tried again. Tuppence bent lower still. It was only a breath. Mr. Brown. The voice stopped, but the half-closed eyes seemed still to send an agonized message. Moved by a sudden impulse, the girl said quickly, I shan't leave the flat. I shall sit up all night. A flash of relief showed before the lids descended once more. Apparently Mrs. Vandermeyer slept, but her words had awakened a new uneasiness in Tuppence. What had she meant by that low murmur? Mr. Brown. Tuppence caught herself nervously looking over her shoulder. The big wardrobe loomed up in a sinister fashion before her eyes. Plenty of room for a man to hide in that. Half ashamed of herself, Tuppence pulled it open and looked inside. No one, of course. She stopped, stooped down and looked under the bed. There was no other possible hiding place. Tuppence gave her a familiar shake of the shoulders. It was absurd, this giving way to nerves. Slowly she went out of the room. Julius and Sir James were talking in a low voice. Sir James turned to her. Look, lock the door on the outside, please, Miss Tuppence. and take out the key. There must be no chance of anyone entering that room." The gravity of his manner impressed them, and Tuppence felt less ashamed of her attack of nerves. "Say," remarked Julius suddenly, "there's Tuppence's bright boy. I guess I'd better go down and ease his young mind. That's some lad, Tuppence." "How did you get in, by the way?" asked Tuppence suddenly. "I forgot to ask." "Well, Albert got me on the phone all right. I ran round for Sir James here, and we came right on. The boy was on the lookout for us, and was just a mite worried about what might have happened to you. He's been listening outside the door of the flat, but couldn't hear anything. Anyhow, he suggested sending us up in the coal lift instead of ringing the bell. And sure enough, we landed in the scullery and came right along to find you. Albert's still below, and must be just hopping mad by this time." With which Julius departed abruptly. "Now then, Miss Tuppence," said Sir James, "you know this place better than I do. Where do you suggest we should take up our quarters?" Tuppence considered for a minute or two. "I think Mrs. Vandermeyer's boudoir would be the most comfortable," she said at last, and led the way there. Sir James looked round approvingly. "This will do very well. And now, my dear young lady, do go to bed and get some sleep." Tuppence shook her head resolutely. "I couldn't thank you, Sir James. I should dream of Mr. Brown all night. But you'll be so tired, child." "No, I shan't. I'd rather stay up, really." The lawyer gave in. Julius reappeared some minutes later, having reassured Albert and rewarded him lavishly for his services. Having in his turn failed to persuade Tuppence to go to bed, he said decisively, "At any rate, you've got to have something to eat right away. Where's the larder?" Tuppence directed him, and he returned in a few minutes with a cold pie and 3 plates. After a hearty meal, the girl felt inclined to pooh-pooh her fancies of half an hour before. The power of the money bribe could not fail. "And now, Miss Tuppence," said Sir James, "we want to hear your adventures." "That's so," agreed Julius. Tuppence narrated her adventures with some complacence. Julius occasionally interjected an admiring bully. Sir James said nothing until she had finished, when his quiet, "Well done, Miss Tuppence," made her flush with pleasure. Join me for the next video. Join me for the next video of Secret Adversary. Okay, I'll see you then. Join me the next video. Okay, bye for now.